face and the marginalized nature of women in terms of making a contribution in their societies is the quote at the right: "The biggest challenge facing our world today," Jimmy Carter says, "is based on the presumption that men and boys are superior to women and girls." And he goes through so many issues, sex trafficking, gender issues of all kinds, lack of education, dowries. It's a very interesting study. But as another framing thought, I would say I'm not sure that it does a lot of good for us to be making the case, just banging on the door and saying, let's get more women into leadership. I think the more effective argument is freeing up the capacity and the potential of every human being to make the world a better place. And as we're seeing in our world right now, there was a very interesting article in Time magazine a few months ago about the movement toward more autocratic, more power-mongering leaders, whether it's the Soviet or Russia or North Korea, even in our own cultural context, and in European countries, the nationalist approach to feeling that countries need to have a very strong, agentic, dominating, take charge leader. And what's that doing to the world order? So just a quickie, many of you who know this literature would know that the Wall Street Journal back in 1986 produced the concept of the glass ceiling, where you could see what was above, but you could clearly not get there. So the rise of women was blocked by invisible forces. That metaphor, partly legislatively, has changed, whereas many more people recently have been using the image of the labyrinth as illustrated on the cover of the book to your right by Alice Eagly, E-A-G-L-Y, a real classic called Through the Labyrinth. And she suggests that women's life journeys with jobs, moving, home responsibility is much more like a labyrinth where they can't even see where they're going, and that there are unexpected twists and turns and sometimes dead ends for them. And then in a more recent book by Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, she used the imagery of a jungle gym and said that the way to get to the top, there's only one way to get to the top of a ladder, but many ways to get to the top of a jungle gym, and suggested that women really are working more with a jungle gym metaphor than a glass ceiling. So I want to be very clear, and some people have questions about this. The shorthand for a lot of the literature is that women are this way and men are that way. I found a book by Turner that's called Difference Works, really helpful in using this overlapping bell curve, that there are some differences, and these are statistically verifiable, in the way women in general tend to lead and the way men in general tend to lead. But there are many women who lead like men, and we can probably name some. And there are many men who lead more in a traditionally what's considered a female way of leadership. So I don't want to suggest that this is absolutes. I think essentialism is a problem, and we should recognize that there's a very large overlap in the middle of those two bell curves. The reality, though, in 2018 is that we still have a problem, and we still have not figured out how to address the problem, assuming people even want to address the problem. So there's an organization based in New York City called Catalyst, catalyst.org, that covers a lot of literature and research and distills what's out there literally around the world, primarily around corporate leadership. But this is the pyramid of the S&P 500 companies as of last year. And you can see that in 2017, only 5% of the CEOs of these 500 companies were women, and only 11% of the top earners in those companies were women. And you can go to the Catalyst website and find historically what have been the trends in those areas. So about 21% of the board seats have been held by women. Interestingly, just to show how current this issue is and the amount of work that's being done on it, the California State Legislature this week began addressing a bill that would require publicly traded companies that are headquartered in California to have at least one woman on the board. And also, interestingly, the article that if you get on the news sources, you can find out that a surprising percentage of companies have less than one woman at this point, and I think only 25% have two women or more on their corporate boards. So, like Europe, and Norway leads the way, the Scandinavian countries lead the way. The governments of those countries several years ago have begun mandating a certain percentage of women on corporate boards, anywhere from 10 to 20 to 40% in Norway. So that's something that's happening right now. And then within higher education, which I'm assuming most of us are following and invested in, it's very clear that the senior leadership of, this is US, higher education is very male normed and demographically very male. So this was an interesting slide from a study that was compiled in 2016 by the American Council on Education, the big daddy of the higher ed organizations in Washington, D.C., which reflected this pipeline that we keep saying women are not qualified or women are not prepared, when in reality, as of 1981, women in U.S. higher ed, now with about 20 million students, earned more than 50% of the bachelor's degrees, and as of 2006, began earning more than 50% of doctoral degrees. So the problem is not getting women the education they need, because at every level, from associate's level through doctorates, women now are earning the majority of degrees. That's the study. Interestingly, and this is a big area of concern for people working on this issue within higher ed, the same study from the American Council on Education indicated that the number of women presidents had increased, but still, this is the 2016 report, only 27% of the presidents of US colleges and universities, including community colleges, which tend to have more women, women's colleges, which tend to have more women, and Catholic colleges, which tend to have more women, only 27% of the presidents were women. So in terms of providing role models and leadership, there's still work to be done on that front. Just quickly, because I know that many of you are not connected with Christian higher ed, but it is the area of research I've been doing. We've been tracking those in leadership who have a vice president title or a chief title, like chief enrollment officer, chief student development officer, since 1998. So now this would be 20 years we've been tracking this. You can see, partly because the number of institutions in the Council for Christian Colleges has grown. The blue is the number of men who are in VP or higher or chief roles, which now, as of 2015, was 575 individual men in comparison to 146 women. What's happening is that many campuses are trying to diversify their senior leadership teams, so they're creating positions, for example, a VP for diversity positions now, VP for marketing, sometimes a VP for HR is now on the cabinet. So what used to be the big 5 positions on an institutional cabinet, you're now seeing much more diversity, and part of that diversity of title relates to campuses moving people of color and women onto cabinet level roles for the sake of these new positions that have been created. So I don't want to take a lot of time, although I'd be happy to take some questions on this. Part of the question is whether there's what's called a stained glass ceiling that is really influential in holding women back within that sector. And an old study, but a very large study, and a piece of research that was conducted with funding from the Pew Charitable Trusts, looked at the attitudes and perceptions of people who self-defined as being evangelical in the United States. And the summary of that study was that in their heart of hearts, people who self-identify as evangelical have a worldview that could be characterized as a hierarchically ordered universe. So there was some teaching in the church back in the 70s and 80s, and still quite prevalent in some sectors of the fundamentalist church, that honestly believes that men in some ways are to be in charge, to be the head, to be more honored, and women are to be in a more subservient, supportive role. So I thought the phrase hierarchically ordered universe was a nice way of capturing some of the dynamics that women face in that sector. I just put this cartoon in partly as a sad reality as we think about many campuses, both secular and Christian campuses, the number of very talented women, and we could again name them, who tend to be in support roles either because of lack of education or lack of encouragement to get more education, or for any number of reasons. Highly talented women are kept in positions that are important in the functioning of our institutions, but do not have high salaries and are not in decision-making positions. So they're basically doing the functionary roles that keep institutions moving, but are not given the recognition for the capacity that they have. So you can see the sign there at the bottom that says, "You are here for," I took this woman to be in a secretarial or support staff position, but I'm making that up. One other slide that I won't spend a lot of time on, but if you are interested in the evangelical subculture or the Christian context for leadership development, this is a book called Lost Women of the Bible that's been one of my longtime favorites. Author is Carolyn Custis James, who talks about the fact that God's intention for human relationships was that men and women, and obviously there's a continuum on gender too, so I just am using that as shorthand, but that men and women are complementary and gifted in different ways, both as individuals and beyond. And too often in the church, this Hebrew word ezer, E-Z-E-R, has been translated from Genesis as women are meant to be the helpmeet or the helper of men, whether that's in marriage, whether that's in the church, whether that's in secular work settings. There are people that would believe that women should not be teaching men, women should not be in authority over men. And the extreme end of the fundamentalist spectrum, I think, still is advocating those positions, as is being debated by a number of denominations right now. But she makes the point that the same Hebrew word is used 21 times in the Old Testament, and 16 of those times are actually used as a reference to God. So the psalm that many of us would know about looking to the hills from whence our help comes, and God being our helper in times of trouble, actually use the same Hebrew word. So it's not a diminutive, dismissive word of the role that women should have, but rather, if 16 of the 21 times ezer is used in the Old Testament, refer to God and God's power and God's ability to make things happen and get things done. It's a very powerful military word that has been, I think, distorted and misused in very unhelpful ways that have kept women down. So the question we want to talk about is two things, really. What's holding women back? And then why is it important that more women are advancing into leadership given the state of our country and our world? So I've put this slide to suggest that there's really two things. One is ongoing external organizational and cultural barriers, which are very real. And one of the articles that I have actually identifies 27 different barriers at different levels of the organization that are documented in the literature as holding women back. But the other, I think, more interesting set of barriers is the internal and the motivational barriers, where women themselves are not aspiring to leadership, would say they do not want to be in leadership for any number of reasons. So I just Googled power organizational charts. Almost always the image when we think about organizational structure or organizational charts comes like the image at the left. And I think we are beginning to see, partly through the theory building book that I helped with in the ILA series, that the way we think about leadership, typically, historically, because men were writing the books, men were advocating certain theories, there were assumptions about a structural hierarchical approach to leadership, as pictured on the left, whereas women often being more collaborative and interested in empowerment and working as teams to get work done, think of leadership more as the image on the right as a networked approach. In fact, there's literature about the networked approach to leadership. Why do we have a problem? I think a fresh insight for me that might be helpful to others is that in the book on women in leadership in higher ed, but this is true across all organizational contexts, there has been assumptions made for the last 30 or 40 years, actually, that the problem was with we needed to get more women into the pipeline. If we could get women into the pipeline, get them educated, they would enthusiastically swim upstream and squirt out the other end of the pipeline in senior level leadership roles, which verbally organizations were saying that they wanted. So Barbara Kellerman up at Harvard and Deborah Rohde, who's out at Stanford Law School, co-authored a chapter on the fallacy of the pipeline and said, we have been trying to fix this problem for 30 years by addressing the pipeline theory. This is out of their chapter in the book, which has been based on male norm assumptions of what motivates women to move into leadership. And we have made very little progress because our assumptions have been wrong to solve the problem. Another chapter in this book, which was authored by a woman named Nan Cohane, pictured there, who was the president of Wellesley and then moved to be the president of Duke, specifically looked at some research that she conducted she and a team conducted at Duke, but then was asked to redo the research up at Princeton at the time of the 40th anniversary of Princeton becoming co-ed, because they were seeing that very few female students at Duke and then again at Princeton were seeking high status, high power, high visibility positions. And when they did this research on both of those major premier campuses, one of their conclusions is that the graduates of these campuses and the female students on these campuses largely said that they weren't interested in very visible positions like student government president or their class president, but they would prefer to lead in organizations that represented a cause that they cared about and believed in. So they were willing to lead, but they were not willing to put themselves into high visibility, high status positions. Interestingly, even at places like Duke and Princeton, because of concerns about dating and how they would be perceived as women. So she suggests in this chapter that we need a more capacious, a broader definition of leadership. And I'm citing here Roberta Hestenes, who was the first woman president of a CCCU institution back in the 80s, Eastern College and now University near Philly, who says leadership is the ability to make a difference by influencing others, and that it can be manifested either through the use of power or influence or authority. So a couple of thoughts on why it's been so challenging to get women to move into leadership. And there are so many reasons, including those 27 external gender-based barriers that have been identified in the literature, which I'm glad to send you that article if you're interested in. But even yesterday, I get the news feed from The Atlantic, and there was a story yesterday about how young girls lose their confidence between age 8 and age 14. On a 100-point scale, the girls between 8 and 14, between 8 and 14 reported demographically across a very large sample, about a 30% drop in confidence by girls by the time they reached 14. So there's been a lot of research on whether women lack ambition and whether women and men view power differently. But interestingly, even yesterday, this Atlantic article and research is confirming that somehow in school and relationally and in our culture, girls are losing their confidence by the time they hit age 14. So a really interesting book that I would recommend to all of you is called The Confidence Code, which is helpful, I think, to people of color, to men, and to women. But what it talks about, and you can see the image on the right there, of the woman hanging onto the tightrope while the man walks across it. Excuse me. And they emphasize that confidence involves action, doing, mastering, and deciding. So here's a slide I'll just let you read while I cough on how confidence can be gained. I think one of the most interesting recommendations is changing the language from me to we, that women will tend to step into leadership if they're doing it for a collective whole, but less inclined to do it for a me. And that all of us simply need to practice making decisions as one way of gaining confidence. Another source in the literature that I think is very important and was a cover story of Harvard Business Review a few years ago talked about the process of people beginning to identify an identity as a leader. And this cover story talked about the fact that women often have problems with the process of beginning to see themselves as a leader and being taken seriously as a leader by others. And somehow there needs to be a fundamental identity shift that's breaking down in girls between the age of 18 and 14 and then on into adulthood, where they do not see themselves in a male normed, hierarchical, competitive, what's called agentic model of leadership as either wanting or aspiring to that form of leadership. Another really interesting article that has changed my thinking on this topic is Who Will Lead and Who Will Follow by Daru and Ashford, which emphasizes that, I'll just read this quote so you can be attentive to it, a leadership identity is co-constructed in organizations as individuals claim and grant leader and follower identities in their social interactions. So this happens in different country contexts, at different points in life. It's a very dynamic process. It's a reciprocal role where an individual is beginning to get a sense that I could be a leader, and others are affirming that you have a leadership ability or potential. And this is happening. This is the research question those scholars were looking at. What is involved in coming to see yourself as a leader and to be seen by others as a leader? It involves this internalization process. One-on-one and small group, it relates to a relational recognition of leadership identity that's granted by others, and then collective endorsement by the place where you work or worship. So there may be individuals who believe they have leadership capacity, but the collective endorsement is not coming from the organization they are embedded in. I'm going to be very quick here and just go through a few slides of books that I think might be helpful, because the literature is beginning to show that getting more diverse perspectives around the leadership table is really helpful. And there are a number of books that illustrate the benefits of having multiple perspectives around the leadership table. This is one of my favorites, which is Short, The Female Vision, which talks about how women tend to care about the social fabric. This is completely secular and corporate of the organization or the company. They have broad scale noticing where they're paying attention to bigger things than the laser beam focus of goal setting or profit. And they come to work wanting to be satisfied by the culture of the place where they work in ways that are inconsistent often with the driven goal agentic nature of corporate culture. Another one that's really interesting and I think helpful is called Difference Works. I mentioned this, that women tend to be, and this is what we saw in the Princeton and Duke studies, less comfortable claiming superiority over others and prefer to keep the power field flat. So women tend to minimize their own role. And she, as a woman, might point outward and give credit to others rather than trying to take credit onto herself. So in a male-normed world where individuals like to look like they can get things done and claim all the credit and receive benefits of that for themselves, women tend not to think that way and don't want to function that way. And then lastly, a book that's interesting called The Athena Doctrine, and the subtitle there is How Women, and then it says in parentheses, and the men who think like them will rule the future. Is a study of 64,000 people around the world. And one of the questions they asked half of the group to identify characteristics of leadership, like being collaborative, being powerful, being decisive. Did you see that more as a male approach to leadership or a female? When they asked the flat out statement, the world would be a better place if men thought more like women, surprisingly, 66% of all of the adults, 63% of the men, 65% of millennials agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. So I'm going to end with this and then turn it over for some questions. But as I think about the literature and what we know, some of you I know are dads with daughters who care about this. Some of you are women who are early in your careers and have a great future ahead. How can we encourage women, if you're a man in a context that may not be particularly supportive of women, what can we do? I just identified 4 suggestions there. Women, I think in general, and maybe millennials, want to have a platform to influence a cause that they believe in. So to hook motivating people to get into leadership around a cause, and to affirm that we can make a difference with our lives by putting our shoulder behind a cause that's important to us. Women will step up into leadership for those reasons, but not to stick their hand up and say, I want to be a president. Secondly, a lot of our research is finding the importance of developmental relationships, whether that's mentoring, coaching, or sponsoring. So for men who are in the majority of power positions in these organizations, to be proactive, to offer developmental relationships is really, really important. And then thirdly, people of faith tend to care about how they've been gifted and what they're being called to, and will step into leadership if they feel that God has given them gifts that are used for the collective good. And that relates to the last one. We just published an article about relational responsibility, that women will step into leadership because they want to honor someone above them, alongside them, below them, and they care about those people and want to contribute their gifts and talents to make their workplace better for everybody. I've identified a bunch of books here that I've referenced, and would be glad to share information about those, or you can Google them and find them for yourself. But these are books that have been helpful to my thinking. So what are your thoughts? Any comments in the chat box about personal experiences that relate to any of this? Any questions or any pushback? Lacey's going to handle that, so we'll see what you folks come up with.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Longman, for that presentation. We are going to go ahead and make some time for questions. We invite your feedback. We would love to hear from you in the chat box, as well as any previous questions that we've received through the registration form. We're going to try and address in the time that we have left. So I'm going to field the questions as they come in. Feel free to, again, type them in that message box. You can send it to everyone, or you can actually opt to send it to me directly. So either way, I'll be able to see it. So Dr. Longman, the first question drawn from the responses ahead of today's presentation, let me just read the question. In the moment of the hashtag #MeToo movement, a lot of male leaders are foregoing mentor relationships with female colleagues. What are some practical ways to encourage male mentors at this time?
So that question relates to the last slide that I showed about how important it is, and it's a wonderful, timely question, how important it is for people who are in positions of authority and have the ability to mentor or coach, or the new literature, as one of the books was, even sponsor women, how important it is for people to step up to the plate. And honestly, every day you watch the news, and this topic or dimensions of this topic is either in the national news or with the current situation with the Me Too movement and the Judge Kavanaugh situation in Washington, D.C. right now. I don't have the wording exactly in front of me. Did you say how important it is, or how can men do that?
Yeah, so the wording is practical ways to encourage male mentors. Yeah.
One of our doctoral students here is just doing a really interesting study on male men advocates who championed a woman who has now moved into the presidency of a Christian institution, and she interviewed them to find out what motivated them to go out on a limb and advocate, I think in every case, for the first woman president at that institution. So I think there's a shorthand that mentors tend to talk with people that they're trying to support. Coaches, executive coaches, tend to talk to these people, and sponsors tend to talk about them or talk on their behalf to others about them. And I think all 3 of those roles are really important. There's a huge body of literature on mentoring and a lot of interesting research on the effectiveness of formal mentoring programs versus informal, but minimally, I think that men can play a tremendous role in being mentors informally. There was an interesting article in Harvard Business Review that was from March of this year that was titled "Mentoring Women is Not About Trying to Rescue Them." That a lot of times men care and perceive themselves as kind of reaching down and bringing a woman up. And this article talked about the concept of reciprocal mentoring and really going into it with a more mutual sharing of ideas and perceptions, both professionally and personally, and enter into a mentoring relationship that was perceived to be a two-way street with learning desired from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some of our doctoral students are on their webinar. I've had two men on my research team. One, I think both, one has two daughters and wanted to just be embedded in a research team about these issues. The other told me that in his office staff, people said to him, I could tell that you really changed just by being on this team and understanding the challenges of these 27 external barriers and as well as the internal motivational barriers. So I think the idea of reciprocal mentoring, even I like that Sheryl Sandberg in her Lean In book had a very good chapter on mentoring. And one of her points is that busy people have too much to do and don't really want the psychological obligation of saying, I will mentor you. But I think in a more collaborative way to say, I'm interested in what you're experiencing and what it's like for you as a woman to work in this institution or this company. And I would love to offer any expertise I have in exchange for just meeting with you once a month to talk about your life experiences. And when I think about my own life, I definitely had one male mentor who made all the difference. And partly it's just believing and speaking potential and speaking affirmation into women who have a lot of capacity but may have lost their confidence over time.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the shorthand version would be anything you want to read about being a mentor. In some ways, I think the informal, less obligatory mentoring works better and is more comfortable. But also to be a coach like the 1 Minute Manager and to speak into other people in 1 minute when you see something that could help them. I think we get very little honest feedback, and that expects a lot of a relationship. Or to be a sponsor or an advocate, as this dissertation research is finding, by men who go out on a limb and reinforce that women can get a lot done, maybe in different ways, but they need to be respected for what they can bring. All of that would be important and good.
Great. Yeah, so shifting from men to women and to women who are hoping to advance, are advancing. You mentioned that 30% drop in confidence that girls experience between the age of 8 and 13. And there is a question submitted ahead of time about growing in confidence. What can that look like for women? How can we grow in confidence as leaders and kind of, in a sense, recover perhaps what we lost when we were younger, and have that confidence that it takes to really step into leadership positions?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the slide that was from the confidence code. Something as simple as making decisions, which is one of the recommendations they make. Women almost always, I shouldn't say this, defer to others because we want other people to be, we want to make life good for other people. We want to be supportive. We want to be affirming. So now that I have my voice back, I'll just go to these 5 points and say, just act. I mean, there's a wonderful book that's called Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader, that says we can't think our way into leadership. We have to act and take risks. And that's where girls stop taking risks because they're afraid to fail and they want to please people. This is yesterday's Atlantic news story about how these 8 to 14-year-old girls lose their confidence. But to get outside of your comfort zone and take steps to act and then feel better because you did something that you weren't sure you could do. Another big point of the article yesterday was that girls ruminate. I mean, they just think and worry about relationships. And they say the confidence code is about women. The new research is about girls. Think too much and we think about the wrong things. And we always assume the worst, and then we spend a lot of time ruminating on that. And then just practice finding your voice. I mean, there's another great Harvard Business Review article about how rarely women speak. And some of you may have heard in the Obama White House the commitment of the women in the senior leadership team at the White House, how they agreed that they would reinforce and affirm when a woman did speak. You wouldn't think that women working in the White House did that. But often women say something and everyone ignores it. And then 10 minutes later, a man says the same thing and it's picked up as his idea. So they just agreed that they would support one another.
Yeah.
But I think the main thing that I would say is, as I've worked with this research for the last 5 or 10 years, the more we know the research, the more we know that what women have to bring is really, really important for the health, even financial health, relational health, retention, success, morale, and organizations. And we can take confidence that even if we feel like a square peg in a round hole, we need to be there and we need to be heard and we need to be bringing alternative perspectives. So with the financial crisis, there's been a lot of research. If there were more men at the top of Lehman Brothers and other places, in fact, if it had been called Lehman Sisters instead of Lehman Brothers, we might have not had so much high risk decision making that really brought the country to its knees financially, because there were not enough women in the room caring about that fabric and thinking long term rather than short term, high testosterone.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's interesting. Someone also mentioned sort of that external environmental factor. Maybe I have the confidence, maybe I have the desire, but the fact of the matter is that I have a need to limit administrative assignments that are given to me because I'm capable of doing them, but they prevent me in some ways for gaining opportunities for leadership. And I'm not sure what exactly that term is, when there is sort of this assumed responsibility that also is, and women end up signing up for more administrative tasks and things that might kind of keep them in the micro day-to-day and perhaps limit their ability to think big and think beyond and into greater capacity.
That's a great question. Did you ask the question or do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, so do you have any suggestions in that direction? How could someone, a woman who wants to advance in leadership, frame and hem in the administrative assignments that they receive?
So the overarching concern, as we saw with the diagram of the woman looking at the box on the floor, is that women often are raised to not disappoint people, to serve, accentuated in the church, to absorb pain, to overextend themselves for the sake of saving other people from overextending themselves, to take things on, whether it's the balance between home care and professional care, or feeling like we should honor when we're asked we should do it. This leads to what I think of as a functionary approach to your work. So you think of even the people, almost always the president's assistant or executive assistants or whatever title they give people to try to give them more stature. A lot of women get into these functionary roles, and because they're good and because they work till midnight and because they're conscientious and because, the confidence code image was that man walking on the tightrope who has a lot of confidence, even if he doesn't have competence, and the woman hanging down from the tightrope who has a lot of competence but doesn't have confidence. That's the dynamic that happens in a lot of organizations where the senior level leadership is male with high salaries and decision-making power, and the women are hanging down from the rope with a lot of competence, but they're in functionary roles and they keep being given more and more. So one thought is around the suggestions on the last slide, to think about your giftedness, think about what God might be calling you to make the biggest difference with your life that you can make, and say, I have a limited amount of bandwidth, and when people keep giving you functionary tasks to find your voice and say, I'm doing A, B, C, D, and E, this is my desire for my next step professionally, and this is what it'll take to get me there. If you're going to give me F, I need to give up A, B, C, D, or E, and you'll need to assign that to someone else because I want some stretch assignments. I'd like to be doing something bigger that will allow me to kick the tires of a new potential role down along the way. And I think sometimes taking ownership for your own professional growth, again, maybe for the sake of the we, I think I could do more if I was higher positioned in my organization to have a broader reach of influence
Right.
than taking on functionary roles that consume all our time but don't get us anywhere.
Right. That's great. A quick question from the chat. A book or article was mentioned during this presentation that pertained to something along the lines of 27 obstacles for women in leadership. What was the title and author of that?
Right. You can dig it out. It'll be available. It's called Making the Invisible Visible, a cross-sector analysis of gender-based leadership barriers. And it was published in the Human Resource Development Quarterly in the summer of 2016.
Okay.
The lead author is from she's from Shippensburg. I know these people from the International Leadership Association. One is at Biola and one is at Shippensburg, but it's called Making the Invisible Visible.
Okay.
From Human Resource Development Quarterly, summer of 2016.
Great. We have a few more minutes here. How about another question? Is that all right? So
Sure.
there is a bit of a Christian higher ed perspective question kind of coming from that arena. So here it is. How do we expand, strengthen, and support the advancement of women in Christian higher ed when the theology of so many schools is in opposition to such leadership for women?
Mm-hmm. I would say, again, research from the corporate sector talks about the importance of having what's called a constellation of developmental relationships. So I'm looking at these book covers, reading books like Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader, which is totally corporate but totally relevant, reading books like The Confidence Code, reading books like the Athena Doctrine, reading books like Executive Presence. And somehow, like I have through the International Leadership Association or through the CCCU, you find a network of people who believe in you and want your best and believe that you have something to offer so that your life really makes the greatest possible impact. I think people can be in lonely places. We see this with the multi-ethnic leadership development work that we do, that people are often feeling very lonely on their campus. But they know that there's a broader network that believes in them, is cheering for them, wants their best, is sharing resources, is there when you're feeling discouraged. And there need to be people feel called to work in hard places. I mean, there would be people that almost feel like I'm a missionary on this campus. I didn't say this, but in these CCCU institutions, Christian higher ed, there's about 20% women in senior leadership, 40% faculty, and 60% students who are women. So the 60% women students and the 40% men students need to see women in senior leadership roles. So some people feel called. But I would say the two suggestions are, one is to read, because the more you read, even books like The Female Vision, which may be 100 pages and cost $12, $10, it's very encouraging to say, I may feel like a square peg in a round hole, but I know that my organization needs the perspective that I bring, and I'm going to find my voice and bring it. So the constellation of developmental relationships and keeping a couple of these books, and even we do here a book group called Leaders Are Readers. It's not readers are leaders, because all readers are not leaders, but hopefully all leaders are readers. We're reading books like these and we're talking about them together, and it brings faculty and staff and administrative leaders together. So I think find your support network so you're not feeling so isolated.
Great. Well, we are just about out of time. Dr. Longman, is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we wrap up today?
I think I would just share a verse that's very important in our doctoral programs and important to me too. which is Ephesians 2:10, the book of Ephesians, the letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, now in Turkey, where he says of every individual, you're God's workmanship. He would say, we've been created in Christ Jesus for good works, and our job in life is to walk into those good works. And I think our job, whether we're a person of faith or not, is to help others and to help ourselves be fully what God designed us to be. Each of us has a set of gifts and talents. And I think, as Jimmy Carter would say, when half the population is marginalized around the world, we're losing the capacity and the perspective that the world needs. So I would take that verse, whether you're a person of faith or not a person of faith, and begin looking at people as having great potential. And everybody has capacity, and our job collectively and as individuals through these developmental relationships is to help people walk into the fullness of what God designed them to be and do and contribute in a world that is full of need.
Well, with that, thank you again, Dr. Longman, for this presentation, for all of the resources, research, recommendations that you offered today. And thank you to everyone from all across the country, and maybe even out of the country, for joining us today for this webinar. We do look forward to offering more webinars in our Critical Issues in Higher Ed series, webinars like these that are really engaging with issues that higher ed faces and ways we can galvanize and think together about how to address them. So please do be on the lookout for more info. If you do want to know more about our doctoral programs here at APU, take a look at our website. It's apu.edu/graduate/doctoral. I also do want to note this presentation has been recorded. Everybody who registered will get a follow-up email asking for your feedback and also hopefully providing that recorded talk. So thank you so much again, everyone, and we hope you have a blessed rest of your day and a great start to the weekend.
Thank you all. I put my email address at the bottom there if anyone wants to pop a note. Have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.